Thanks so much, everyone. Feel free to walk in with your snacks and coffee, and we're going to get started. And my water, thank you. Welcome to this session that's called Engaging Storytelling in Journalism. My name is Elizabeth Ratcher. I'm the Director of Industry Programs at Hot Docs. Our festival ended about a day ago, so I'm feeling rather fresh and very happy to be here with you. And happy to have this conversation about form and audience with an incredible group here that I'll present. Erica Tustin, digital editor from the Toronto Star, Matt Frainer from the Globe and Mail, senior editor of Mobile and Interactive, and we have Frank Ferrito, series co-creator, series producer, and EP of CBC's Interrupt This program, and his co-conspirator, creator, series director, and EP of Interrupt This program, Nabil Menji. So this session is a really interesting one, and I was excited that it is a key discussion of the Discoverability Summit here to discuss really how journalism is changing to meet the demand of storytelling. And it's interesting because when we started this conversation off earlier, it was about these two areas, form and audience. How is form changing as in journalism, really where news and stories intersect? What does this mean for journalists? What does this mean for storytellers, filmmakers, and TV makers? And actually, what does this mean for audiences? So we know that form is changing, but now how are our audiences changing? How are they consuming media in a different way? And how are they contributing to the media that we make? To put into a little context of where journalism and story intersect and our audience's desire and appetite for it, Hot Docs did a research 2 years ago, and we asked audiences, when they're not at our festival, how are they consuming documentaries and why are they consuming them in whatever form and expression, not just the long form as we think of it, short and other documentary factual content. And they said that it was primarily for educational reasons they were accessing this point of content. And I think that's a very interesting point to branch off of as to why audiences are engaging in these stories. When we look at form and how it's shifting these days, we know that news is more than just information, it really is a story, and the form is shifting, whether it be in our social media feeds, whether it be in short form content on broadcast. We see the CBC announcing short form docs and other new outlets that are coming out. Even Hot Docs itself is partnering with the New York Times for our filmmakers in the Hot Docs Blue Ice Fund to create short form content from their feature-length films. So we know that form in all of its expressions of storytelling and journalism is shifting as well. So when we begin this concept and conversation of form and audience, we're going to ask these questions to really try to get a sense of understanding how has journalism in this form changed over the past years, and do we think it's changed? And I think that's an interesting point to start a story. Where do you feel your audiences have changed, and where do you feel the content, the form has changed?
I think the format is faster. The pace of stories is always now faster because we must adapt to digital and television. So it's changing a bit the way we're telling stories, and the way we build Interrupt This program is, rather than telling a long story of 21 minutes, we have 4 short stories that are intertwined. And for us, it's a new way of doing television. I mean, it's not revolutionary, we're not the only one doing this, but I think now it must be shorter, self-contained, and because they're gonna watch it on television, but mostly they're gonna watch it on the web, on CBC Art Site in our case. So we must adapt to this new format, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree that the template, the way that you package and put together material has changed to adapt the delivery method as well. So i.e. phone or tablet or social media, etc. But the foundation of reporting and what those stories were meant to deliver to you, I think is actually improved in this kind of digital era, in the way that publishers are held way more accountable for what they're covering, what they're saying, what they're not covering, because you have an open dialogue with the public instantly at your fingertips. So, there really is no excuse not to get the story right.
Yeah, and the audience completely changed things. So I started at the Globe 9 years ago as a copy editor. On the night desk, there was 25 copy editors. We put out a newspaper. That was our job, right? Now, our team basically is in charge of telling stories on mobile for your phone, packaging content for your phone, and the audience there may never pick up the paper, may never read a newspaper whatsoever. They're coming to us from search and social. We don't even think about desktop really anymore. We only think about phone because now more than half of the time Canadians spend online is on their phones, right? And like just this weekend we had a story on Fort McMurray, basically a mobile-first story. Here's what's happening. Here's what's going on. Here's the really, really kind of nuts and bolts of what's happening out there in Fort McMurray. And at any point, 70, sometimes even 80% of the traffic to that story is coming from search. So those weren't even people coming to the Globe's website to find that information. They were searching. I need information before McMurray, give it to me. And we had to say, we're going to serve you with this really particular way of telling that story that resonates with you as a search reader, not as a newspaper reader.
You're bringing into two really interesting topics here. One is really about, what I call the feed syndrome, which is, as you look into your feed and things that you're interested in are being fed to you. So if you're clicking on other news stories, more news stories come to you, or if you're clicking onto people's Facebook posts that are posting about Fort McMurray, et cetera, more stories are feeding into you. So there's this curation aspect that is in one thread. But the second thread is that you're referring to as well, which I think is an interesting point for this conversation, is social journalism versus just journalism. And maybe this is an interesting point to kind of explore those two notions. The one being the social journalism in terms of the question of form changing, whether it be through Read It or Facebook or Twitter. You have real folks reporting on the news faster than essentially it comes out. I think you were talking a little bit about those stories of images from Fort McMurray being on Facebook. How in today's journalism do these sort of non-traditional news sources affect storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, it completely affects it, right? So the Fort McMurray example is just the one that's top of mind, but it's basically like the reader, the audience, everybody's out there producing journalism in a sense, because they're saying, here's what's happened, which was the goal of the newspaper or the news broadcast for decades, was what happened today, right? We can't say what happened today anymore, because that's already been covered by people who are there on the ground. We have to give the context, we have to say, in a sense, curate it, pull it together, figure out what the most important pieces are, give the context, why does this matter, what's the response across the country been, what does this mean for policy, what does this mean for the oil sands, what does this mean for the economy, in terms of the Globe's coverage. So the great thing about it is that it pushes us to do that next step, right? So what, right? We are there to say, so what? We're not there to say, such and such happened today, right?
And I think if you ignore, the Reddit, the Facebook, the Twitter, and people who are actively contributing to that, you do so at your own peril in the way that this to me is like an evolution of the citizen journalism. And that's been around for at least the last, 5-10 years in the way that it was in blog format, that people were self-publishing, publishers were taking advantage of that particular material, and in some cases empowering them to go out and cover kind of local areas of news that they didn't have access to anymore. In this case, we've got this wide network of people all over the world who are telling you what's happening right in front of their eyes. And to Matt's point, our responsibility is to say, okay, we've seen this, we've acknowledged it. What are we going to do now with it? I.e., the verification is a huge, it's a huge responsibility that newsrooms and publishers have, and one that we take quite seriously. But again, we're being delivered this material in order to then inform our reporting, and it's something to certainly take advantage of.
When we're thinking about how story brings into journalism and journalism is moving into story, when you look at content that's being delivered through our social feeds, you were mentioning a little bit more about how reformatted content is coming into our space. And what does that mean for you guys as television producers? Understanding how the shows that you're making that are of a certain format, but then understanding how to bring them into where the eyes are so that audiences can find them.
I mean, it's an exciting time. I think you mentioned the short docs initiative at CBC, the New York Times. I think stories are, I think that the two fields are coming closer to each other. The lines are getting blurred. At one point, I think it's about telling a story with a more human approach rather than just a a news factual approach. Like about a year ago, the New York Times did a series on how ISIS is recruiting around the world. You know, we've all seen the news stories, but they took a more human approach, and I think that video went viral. It was 3 friends, 1 jihadis, and it was two friends that were explaining how one of their friends joined ISIS. But it gave you like such a ground level approach to the crisis, just by showing you that these are regular guys that are trying to figure out their situation, living in Cairo, living in Egypt, in a crazy situation, and also like how one of their friends just got completely indoctrinated into this organization. So I think that it's a very exciting time where like the storytellers and the journalists are sort of coming together to change the narrative in a way.
And as TV producers, I mean, it's great because we have like multi-platforms. You have the TV show, but you have Facebook, you have Twitter, and that's fantastic just to promote a show. And the first reflex as a TV producer is to be wary of these social media. Like I was speaking to a producer yesterday, and she was telling me, you know, I don't like posting my content on Facebook. And I told her, no, just post it online, you know. This is where we're going, we must embrace it. And we had successes that interrupt this program, like we had some posts, some digital posts on Facebook that reached almost 1 million persons. And that's way bigger than the ratings that we have at CBC. So resistance is, you know,
Futile.
it's futile. We must embrace it and be present on Facebook, on Twitter.
And I mean, I agree, but I'm wondering when it comes to these different feeds and our social feed, there's also a lot of advertisement in there. So how do we address, and I'm going to use this term quite loosely, but the media literacy of our audiences to determine the difference between, you know, what is advertisement and what is story?
I think we need a brand that's very like powerful. Like for instance, our show, you know, the brand does not interrupt this program. It's not my small production company in Montreal. It's CBC. You know, so we carry this brand, and yes, there's lots of information on social media, but I think like a strong brand like CBC is something very attractive. And
yeah. With the New York Times partners with documentary makers, right? Like they're putting their brand behind that, and then it amplifies it and also gives it that kind of verification. You know, that's the power of a brand like that.
Yeah.
I'd say on the native side, you know, Facebook and Twitter are actually quite good to work with in the way that they have sets of guidelines themselves in the way that publishers are going to present that material to a readership, and so you have to adhere to actually very strict kind of labeling and identification of what this content is. The trick, in my view, becomes kind of that sideways consumption. Let's say through search, through material that, you know, Toronto Star publishes on the native side. You know, we put labeling and different disclaimers around things, but it's always a conversation internally to say, you know, we don't think the reader recognizes what sponsor means. We don't think the reader recognizes what partner means, and we're constantly searching for ways to really kind of clarify that. Again, though, going back to kind of the trusted brand and the way that we have an awareness of it, we're conscious of it. We're not there to trick anybody with it. It is just part of our business model. However, there might be other publishers that, you know, don't adhere to the same rules, I would say. But it is an evolution of a continuous conversation because it isn't always apparent. But going back to a reader having loyalty to trusted brands that have established themselves as you know, reputable sources of information, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. That brand that interweaves that notion of curation and discoverability are completely connected. Mm-hmm. And whether it be our social media feeds or it be, you know, discoverable on other forms, or other platforms, that's where, you know, we still need to come back to those notions. When we're talking about form and audience, and I'm eager to see, we've talked a lot about what's happening in Canada, but as producers, there's this great question here. Do you notice that press and journalism, this is for Nabil and Frank, are interacting in different ways in the countries that you've been traveling and covering with Interrupt This program?
Yeah, like we shot in Ukraine, in Haiti, in Colombia, and what's striking when you arrive there is that there's no free press. I think the press is owned by oligarchs in the case of Ukraine, by big families in the case of Colombia. So there's like a big mistrust towards the traditional media, and that's very striking. And just to put you in context, with our series, we employ lots of young local journalists. They work as fixers, as researchers, and it's striking to see that, yeah, they are journalists, but they are also activists, and extremely outspoken and critical of their own government, and that's something very different from what we have here in Canada. And what's interesting is that there, the traditional media are not interested in those young journalists. They don't hire them, and they're not interested in millennials. Like, by doing research for our show, you know, the first reflex is you go into local media to try to find stories. And the characters that we found, I mean, most of them weren't even covered by the national media. I mean, we found them through fixers and through like sources on the ground, and that's a big difference.
At the same time, they're using the technology to, like the most striking example in Kiev, there's a crowd-funded news organization that was started by freelance journalists or independent journalists who were fed up of not getting the unbiased reports on TV, so they just started their own online organization called Hromadski.tv, and it's like it grew from like this small, it was like in a basement of someone's house where they were like just posting stuff online during Maidan, and now they're like a very, very prominent news organization that most of the country goes to just get the real deal on what's happening in the country. And it's mostly like, and it's a mix of like, you know, seasoned journalists and young, just, you know, go-getters that are going out there shooting the piece, editing it themselves, and just putting it online.
So as distrust for certain curatorial voices shifted in regions, new ones came up. It's fascinating that they were crowd-funded and crowd-supported, but it reinforces again, you know, all the things that we experience as journalists and storytellers, that, you know, the democratization of media through our social media connections is what, you know, drives these interests. That's very fascinating to see how those homegrown voices come up. Do you feel and see some of these things happening in Canada as well, where other new sources of curation are?
I don't think we're like experiencing this in Canada, like
no,
like what they're having in Kiev.
We still trust.
I think it's a good thing, but
yeah.
But
I think you're seeing young journalists. Like, I think there's a lot of the people we worked with on the Canadian side. You have young journalists going out there and saying, you know what, we need to make our mark. So I'm going to go to Kiev and find like cool stories, and just try to get some commissioning editor to be interested in it. There's a guy that just flew to Colombia that I know. He said, you know what, there's stuff happening in Colombia right now with the peace talks. I'm going to be the first one there, so whenever there's a story, I'm already packaging it, you know, to get it to someone out there.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that they're working differently with news outlets to help get those stories out, or working through more the traditional, you know, television and documentary funding areas?
I don't think they go digital.
Yeah.
Totally, yeah. And we even met with some journalists. There's this woman called Nadine Mazloum in Beirut. She was like this traditional journalist working for LBC, covering the garbage crisis in Beirut. And she thought that they weren't doing enough, you know, to denounce that situation. And so she resigned from her job and just started covering the story herself and posting it on Facebook. Of course, sending the stories to big news organization. But yeah, they take the matters in their own hands. But we don't want this in Canada. I mean, we're just talking about our experience elsewhere.
But it's an important and insightful way to see, you know, how the form of journalism and storytelling is shifting in different regions, but also what it dictates to us is about audience consumption. The demand for accessing this information wherever it comes, especially from a trusted source or from a source that's growing trust, because the stories that they want to see covered aren't being covered in traditional media. I imagine she had a great following on Facebook, and it continued to grow, which reinforced her, you know, to continue to do that work. And this is sort of the crux of this intersection around great storytelling and around, you know, reporting. And and I want to bring it back to understanding more about, those audiences, whether it be in Beirut or Colombia, we're mostly accessing these again through mobile, I imagine, and of course maybe through other, desktop or etc. But what does it mean for our audiences consuming through different devices, whether it be mobile or desktop? And I know that both of you guys have experienced, whether it be at the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail, about the difference of content for mobile versus content for,
For a newspaper.
for the paper.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at how, traditionally you design a story for print and it can be laid out, and you sort of have that print vocabulary of, this is a page with a photo and a big headline and a chart and a caption and a quote or whatever, and I can kind of scan that and read bits and pieces of that story, and then maybe I read halfway through and I kind of am also interested in that, and I sort of scan over to another story, etc. Like that kind of structure of a page that has sort of existed for hundreds of years doesn't exist at all anymore on your phone. And we actually need to kind of like strip away all that and think about the story in a really linear way. Because really what you need to do is to try to keep the reader's attention on your page as they're scrolling through it. Because if they get bored, they're going off to something else. They're going off to Snapchat, they're going off to Twitter. You want to try to say, kind of keep the reader engaged with the layout or the way I'm writing the story or the images or the charts I've chosen to put in the story in a way that gets them to stick around and hopefully read more, right?
Yeah, and you can add, even another layer of complexity to that in the way that when we talk about mobile, you're talking about kind of a traditional article page for mobile browser. But then Snapchat is a valid point, so we talk as kind of publishers, we're already legacy publishers dealing with print products, mobile products, tablet products, which from my perspective, at least my organization, they're all kind of unique amongst themselves and have different strategies and outputs put around them. And then you add in the layer of mobile, of social and Snapchat, and a lot of the different areas of which, in order to grow audience, publishers have to be present. And so then you're facing kind of a distribution model of, 5 products plus, 35 channels within those products. Like it just grows and grows and grows and grows. And so those are kind of those real-time challenges in terms of storytelling. How do you serve those particular properties, with a suitable storytelling format in order to drive your audience, and then the question being the monetization behind that. It's just simple.
Yeah, I mean, basically, Facebook, Google, Apple, Snapchat have all come out with their own distribution structure and platform that's incumbent on the journalists or the newsroom to package their content for. So now we're not only saying we're going to design the story for your phone, we're saying we're going to design the story for your phone, for a Facebook Instant article, for a Snapchat story, and it might be completely different. And we're going to design it for Google M, and that means that Google said, we're going to, give extra credence to stories that are designed using this code spec that they put together, which is a technology problem, but it's also a storytelling problem because their code spec doesn't let you use JavaScript, which sounds like, okay, that's fine, but like that's the crux of the internet that lets us do interactive content, right? So it means that we have to actually kind of almost rethink how we're structuring it, like as Eric was saying, stories for each of these different distribution channels. It's really, really difficult. It's exciting, but it's tough, yeah.
I think that this is where TV makers and filmmakers come into play as well, because I mean, it's really the key is editing, like video editing. I'm an editor by trade. That's why I believe in that. Like, look at the way The Guardian packages their pieces. Look at the way AJ Plus does their pieces online. They're eye-grabbing. Text is huge. Color and music, graphic is huge. So I think there's a new learning curve that's happening where people are finding new ways to present the information and more, like subtitling is now huge because they know it's going through your newsfeed. You're probably not you're not going to see the audio, but the minute you start reading the text, you're like, oh, this looks interesting, and then you click on it.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how video is completely changed for your phone and for Facebook. Right? It's a perfect example. You're just going through the feed, you don't have your headphones in, and then the text comes out and you see it, and you're often watching a video with no sound whatsoever. So it's caption plus images plus really striking visuals, not necessarily on the sound design. Right?
Yeah, it's again adapting the storytelling for the device and the platform, because otherwise if you're sending video out there, the expectation that people are going to stop what they're doing, put their headphones on, play the audio, you've lost about half of that audience.
And what's interesting is that even us, the dinosaurs of television, we can do it. No, we did it for this program. So yes, we can adapt to these new technologies. Yeah.
So did you repackage in smaller video chunks for
Yeah.
Facebook? So
Yeah.
we do 2 or 3 minute chunks and subtitle? Or,
Yeah.
It was also extra stuff, extra footage that we planned to shoot ahead. So it was material and content that's feeding into the show as well. Because I mean, let's face it, a half hour of television is 22 minutes. It's not enough to tell a story of 4 artists around the world. So it was extra material. Yeah, it was a lot of extra material.
And real stories. And I remember 10 years ago when you were thinking of a digital strategy, you would think, I'm going to show some behind the scenes of the show. Nobody cares about this anymore. So it's real stories that we put on Facebook, on Twitter. Yeah.
And what's interesting is even though these are tighter, shorter, maybe they're 1 minute or 1:40, that are grabbing people's attention, how do you feel that the click-through ability to get to the deeper programming, do you feel with this program it has driven, or do you have the data to show that it's driven to the shows?
Yeah, there was a correlation when we were posting things on Facebook and Twitter before, like a week before the broadcast of the show. When we got lots of traction on social media, the ratings were better.
Yeah.
It literally drives
Yeah.
people to the show,
Yeah.
and I know we say that it creates community, but it does. It's true.
It's more
The
authentic than
episode-
just the numbers reflect.
But that's actually a good example because we banked on immigrant communities in Canada because, huge Ukrainian Canadian community, huge Haitian Canadian community, and the Haiti episode was the highest rated because it got such word of mouth from Haitian Canadians living in Montreal. Even we got write-ups in Port-au-Prince. So I think it's the show spread out also by the artist communities that we created in all these different cities. People were actually watching it through VPN, which we shouldn't say, but they were. Yeah.
No, I think it's these examples of, the celebration of the form kind of in all of its expressions. So even these shorter expressions, that are 1 and 2 minutes into longer form that are a 22-minute episode, or, as we're seeing in Field of Vision or other platforms are bringing in the 8-minute and the 7-minute form, and those are similar to these stories coming out of The Guardian and out of the New York Times Op Docs.
I just want to say something. We were talking about platforms, and I call this the pipes. Where is the content going? But what's fascinating is that we live in a world where we have so much access to diverse content, and that's great. As a TV producer, I'm blessed. And I think what we're seeing right now is that there's a thirst for compelling new content, and I think it's the millennials that are forcing us, I know on television, to bring that content on TV, and I think it's great. I mean, the discussion about the platforms is just, it's relevant, of course, but good content will always make its way,
Yeah, it's good content, and it's just, can you package it in a slightly different way that takes into account the technology people are using, whatever, but the storytelling is there, people want that.
And short form is feeding the long form, I believe. It's teasing for you to go see the slightly longer piece, the more in-depth, more research that took a longer time to edit. I mean, there's also something good about short form is that there's a bit more freedom because the confines of television, still are about a commercial break and a specific time. In short form, you can do a 2.5 minute piece. It could be 3 minutes and 10 seconds. There's slightly more freedom editorially and physically in an editing point of view.
And also the stories can be quite satisfying when they're told in the time that they need.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly see that at the festival and the work we've been doing with short form, that we say this, sometimes you don't need a feature-length film, that the story actually really just gets there in 12 minutes or 6 or 18, and that is a satisfying expression of the story. So we're supporting that work, especially when the audiences are there for it, online and also in theaters and in other places. So we see that working.
I would say, just to add to that, from my perspective in the newsroom, I've been at the Star for almost 10 years, And digital has really brought that discussion of long form to the forefront in the way that, you know, it's always been the skill of a reporter to say, I should be telling you this information accurately and succinctly. It doesn't mean that it has to be 100 inches. It doesn't mean that it had to be 20 inches. You're supposed to evaluate the story and give it the space that it deserves. So that question that's always lingered as to whether long form was going to go away, I've never really bought into that notion, because I think long form was overused at a certain point, and maybe still is. Technology and delivery methods have certainly, again, shaped that and brought the discussion to an apex. But if a story needs, you know, this amount of space, it will get that amount of space. And at least from the data that I receive, you know, we're seeing mobile consumption be 50% of the time more on those longer pieces, and that's just been growing and growing and growing over the
Yeah, as
last
people get
while.
used to reading on their phones, there's no problem with someone spending 10 minutes, 15 minutes to read a long form piece. We see it again and again. So,
Or still even buy the paper. That hasn't gone away either, has it? As we were just discussing before.
That's true, but the paper is getting smaller.
It is, yeah, this is true. This is a question that I want to take a lot of time on, because I think it's the notion and the crux of the conversation here about discoverability is, what steps do each of you take to really ensure that your content is being discovered by viewers or readers? And we'll take it in turn, but I think it's going to drive a larger dialogue. Like, what is it exactly that you're doing to ensure that content is discoverable?
I'm going to say something that it sounds maybe too simplistic, but stories that are new, stories that hasn't been told, and good content, I think, is the key.
Best ingredients.
No, seriously.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think this is where we're going. Maybe I'm over optimistic, but I remember 10 years ago on television, we were all doing the same thing. We were doing format TV, you know, design in the Netherlands, and we were all doing the same thing, you know. Now it's so diverse, you know, and there's no excuse. You have this liberty to like just create content and get it out there, you know, and I think that is the key to be discovered.
But the issue is that it's the headline that can make or break. You know, for us, right? So we spend so much time optimizing what's the best headline for this for mobile, what's the best headline for this for social, what are the different tweets we can write off this long form piece. We spend a lot of time, you know, it used to be, okay, we're going to publish this 5,000 word feature, we're going to put it on the website, people will love it because it's a great feature, and then it gets no traffic. Why is it getting no traffic? People must not like long form. But no, people like long form. We just got to tell them why should they care about this one, right? You know, that's the key of like, writing the right type of social promotion, using the right types of images, using an animation or whatever. Just like those tricks. I mean, they are tricks, but it's like how do you get someone to click and then deliver on that after they click, right? Because you're seeing it in your feed or seeing a list of breaking news alerts. How do you phrase something in a way that makes someone want to explore?
I mean, our counterpart to this as TV makers is the demo. You know, to us, when we decided to do the show, we just flew to Beirut on our dime and stayed with family and hooked up with a photojournalist from Toronto who happened to be in Beirut, and we shot something in 3 days. We ended up with a 22-minute pilot, but you know, we put together two minutes demos that sold the show. I have a friend who is doing a doc that was commissioned at Hot Docs last year, and she put together a demo using YouTube clips, and it looked like she went and shot in Bolivia and Japan and France, you know. So we have incredible tools at our fingertips that can help us get discovered, that can help us sell our ideas, because I think it's more than just saying, you know, I have this great idea. It's like how are you going to put it together is another thing.
The packaging and the marketing of the story, we talk a lot about in funding films, and certainly at the pitching forum at Hot Docs, which is like the Dragon's Den in film finance. You'll hear a story being pitched and the title just does not match the story. And it's the first thing the commissioners say, which is like, I will watch this film, but you have to change the title and share with me exactly what it's about. And the same thing when you're titling work. There's so much content out there, and how do you compete with, you know, free dancing cat videos that
I
are...
love dancing cat videos.
And we all do. and other escapism and Game of Thrones and wonderful things, and within the media, journalistic and factual and documentary landscape, there's so much attractive content, but how does it, how do you help it to push out? So we hear about packaging, we hear about titling, we hear about whether we're presenting the work for funding or presenting the work to audience. What else are we doing to ensure that content is discovered by audience?
From my perspective anyway, I've seen changes within my organization to recognize, the change in audience behavior. So, the shift away from direct traffic, to your website, and how then, if we're producing this great content, which we feel is great and we stand behind it 100%, how are we going to reach our shifting audience and gain a new audience? And I think traditional publishers have been slow to adopt this, but I see the change now in the way that we're being very careful and deliberate in terms of evaluating all distribution channels that are available to us. So that would be to the social media, as well as partnering with influencers and communities who are already basically doing great things and have kind of these niche audiences that we see some really key partnerships with. As well as just, you mentioned tools, there are tools, there are really great tools, whether algorithmically based or ones that can actually assist within templating and storytelling that are out there. There are vendors doing some really, really great things. And again, really traditional publishers just being open and positioned to take advantage of all those things are really where, in my view, where we need to be at.
And broadcasters, access to broadcasters has never been, it's not easy, but it's out there, like the Hot Docs of this world, the Real Screens. You go there as an independent producer and you meet with Netflix and Vimeo and Pivot, and that's also very exciting. Like, you don't have to be an established production company to actually go and present something.
Those larger platforms have become more accessible for content creators, and it's a similar vein as we're seeing sort of that's the accessibility of platforms by citizen journalists. Although everyone's thankfully doing their due diligence to make sure that the content that gets out there is verified. It's interesting because when it comes to this notion around discoverability, it's something that certainly at the festival, I'll chime in here a bit to. Bears that burden as well. And we really understand that our brand is the discoverability factor as a curator for this, so that you maybe never, you don't, put it this way, you're in the market for a documentary. It may be short, it may be long, but you don't really know which one, and so you can rely on that brand of Hot Docs to be able to help you find it. And whether that be our partnerships with iTunes, where we have a store in Canada and the US, and audiences can find the content that way, or in other places, whether it be Rogers On Demand or About Fiverr, etc., that it helps to draw different, discoverability elements. So those partnerships, those curators, those greater communities that you tap into as a content creator or as a platform itself are really critical to reaching those key communities and audiences.
Yeah. We did a lot of reporting as the start of the CBC Excellent reporting on missing and murdered Indigenous women's file for the last year and a half or so. And one thing that was key with that was that when we started that project, we put together an advisory panel of experts in the community and in the government to help us understand how to tell that story better. And then when we were publishing pieces of that story, we reached back out to that group and say, here's a piece that we think your community would like. Can you help us get it to the right people? And we'll have stories that get a huge amount of traffic from Facebook, and it's not the traditional audience. It's the Aboriginal community sharing that story among their own group and say, this is a story that's important to us. Where we want to help amplify it. And so that's really, I think, what Eric was touching on too. Is like finding those influencers or other brands to help promote your work.
And discovering new platforms, like look what the NFB is doing. The interactive doc section of the NFB, I find is like the least known, but it's the most powerful. Like High-Rise and Fortress of Kabul, it's discovering that you could tell your story in a totally different way. Like filmmaker friend of mine who did Portraits of Kabul went and shot, thinking he's doing a feature-length doc, and the NFB guided him into saying, no, we can do this interactive portal where people can watch these different stories separately in like the most beautifully designed interface.
They're dynamic interfaces that, and certainly a different form and expression of storytelling that is, we're happy to celebrate, but I still think one that's struggling to find audience.
Absolutely. It's really tough to find an audience for that stuff, especially the non-narrative work that is really difficult to guide a reader through. Like the high-rise stuff is so compelling and so amazing. There's so much great content there. They have a lot of trouble finding partners. We partnered with them. The New York Times partnered with them, but having to get enough of an audience for that content is really, really difficult.
Yeah, and especially like where we see, and I know this is not direct on topic, but it is another expression of storytelling, whether it be VR, and how we access those spaces, because many, news media platforms have become outposts for VR, whether it be your publications in the New York Times and getting VR goggles out to people, and then actually using it as a place for discoverability for this new form of storytelling that has a lot of like deep journalistic principles and documentary principles within it. We certainly have been doing our best to expose audiences to this work, but I think I agree. It's the translation of seeing it be ubiquitous across where we're just chatting with friends like, hey, have you seen that great VR piece? It hasn't quite saturated in that level. And I wonder, why do you think that is when we have all these different ways and pipelines to deliver this content to?
Well, VR specifically is really difficult because people don't have the tools or technology to watch it just yet, right? So when the New York Times launched their VR app, they partnered with, I think it was GE and Austin Mini or Audio or something, the car company basically, to sponsor shipping a Google Cardboard with every single print subscriber. That's millions and millions and millions of dollars.
Those cardboards are not cheap.
Yeah, so they're like a couple bucks each
Yeah.
to hundreds of thousands of subscribers. You have to pay for the packaging and all that kind of thing, right? So we have a VR piece that was at Hot Docs and it's sort of a demo. And the problem for us with that is like, how do you get that out to world readers in a way that gets people to actually download it and look at it, short of partnering with a corporation to get the technology out there, right? It's really, it's difficult.
Yeah, I think I have to say I was at a Google summit, I think it was 2 weeks ago on VR, in the way that everybody's interested in playing in that space, because it does lend itself really well to some storytelling opportunities. And as Matt pointed out, the cardboard is a bit of a barrier. And even currently, I think it is that on YouTube, the VR view of a YouTube video isn't accessible by iPhone yet. So I think it's good that we're having this discussion, because if you do talk to a Google or a YouTube, they would tell you that in 2 years from now they expect this to be everywhere. And so for publishers to get it on the ground level and at least do some experimentation with it and kind of identify what those challenges are, I think it's an important discussion to be having right now.
But I think also when you talk about VR, I mean, we all are trying to get that immersive experience. Everybody wants to create that experience where you feel you're there, and I think traditional documentary has been doing it for a long time. Right now, you're right, it's just getting that technology to be so easily accessible, and it's doing like there's a gaming company that we know work with in Montreal that's beginning to touch on the possibilities of VR and documentary, because you're right, it's about creating the most immersive experience possible for the audience.
Yeah, and it's such a new form. Like one anecdote about our project, we took it out to demo with a bunch of developers and technologists in Toronto. And one thing that everybody who had worked on our project, they were all sort of 5'10" to 6 feet tall, right? I think that shouldn't be a problem. We designed this immersive experience for them. They kind of like, here I am in the space. And one of the women who tried it was 4'10", and she said that as soon as she put the headset on, she felt like she was floating, and it was a completely discombobulating experience. She broke the immersion for her completely, and actually felt kind of like nauseating, right? And there's all of these studies about VR and like how people's physiology reacts differently to it. So there's no idea even how to use the technology, and yet we're trying to really push the storytelling forward, right? So that actually was a really kind of humbling bit of feedback that we got, was like lowering the default height of this experience so that it didn't quite feel as that's difficult for some people to use it, but things you would never know or even think about before you actually put it on people's heads and try it.
The form is still in a
Yeah.
nascent and exploratory space, but it is exciting. You know, we had a discussion in Hot Talks about putting VR on trial and really, you know, deciding like, is it the new next big shiny thing to, you know, save documentary? Jury's still out. The festival's over. But I think the crux of it is that, you know, we will be faced again and again and again with dynamic new technologies that affect story and that engage audience. And as creators, as platforms, and as curators of this work, you know, our responsibility to these forums is to explore them, to celebrate them, but also to make sure that at its core, I think what all of you have said time and time again is that like story is king. You know, a great VR experience only exists because there's a strong story in it. Interrupt This program engages audience into season 2 and 3, you know, because each episode, as well as each little short bit that you're pushing through into social, has strong story behind it. And you know, these two publications have stayed at the forefront of, you know, readership because of the story that they engage with. So we're very proud of ourselves for having a very positive panel before we jumped on board here to say that, you know, story is still it. Like that is the root of it. And to really drive discoverability comes into story and then good curation to drive it out. I feel like we've covered a lot about, go on.
I don't know if it's the
Stop
end of the
you.
panel, but
No,
we're
no.
like extremely optimistic. You know, yes, story is king. We will survive. Television will survive, I believe. You know, but it needs to be funded. I don't want to be a pitch, you know, that every producer does, but because we sometimes think that because we're like moving fastly towards digital, that because of new technologies, we can just do like hire a young journalist and he's gonna shoot a story and post it on Facebook and it's gonna be, you know, a success. You know, you need manpower, you need researchers, you need camerawomen, directors. You know, it just doesn't happen like that. You know.
Well, this is that notion of that the consumption model and the business model are not quite aligned. It's something that you had brought up a little bit earlier. And you know, Matt, what do you, in terms, and you can feel free to you know, explore this idea, is that, you know, we're not about to dissect the business model for online media on this panel. But it's another, that's this afternoon session, I'm just kidding. But, you know, in the short term, how do we, as platforms and as creators, deal with this issue?
So at the Globe, I'll just say that we've recognized that advertising is not going to save us, and that has actually been very freeing from a storytelling point of view. So for our team, you know, our big focus is on long-form, in-depth investigative work, immersive journalism, storytelling tools that really, really amplify the way we tell stories on mobile. And the key with that is that we're not there to drive page views. We're there to drive people to come back over and over again, and they come back enough that eventually they pull out their credit card and subscribe to the Globe. We're not going to win with page views and clickbait, and we're never going to win when 80% of the mobile advertising revenue goes to Facebook and Google, right? So we know that that's not our game. Our game is subscriptions as a private company. So how do we best stand out? We best stand out by producing great journalism. So that's the overlap there, at least at this point in time, is actually quite strong. So I'm happy about that from a selfish journalistic point of view.
Say from the Star's perspective, we used to have a digital subscription model, which we no longer have, so our approach is a little bit different in the way that it's based off audience growth and new product development. And the new products are arguably ones that derive a higher CPM, in the way that mobile is we haven't quite figured that particular piece of it out yet. I mean, we collective large we. And when we're looking at what we want to do next and the spaces that we want to play, generally kind of break it up into two buckets. One that does have a revenue opportunity for us, either be it through Facebook Instant Articles or something like that, and evaluating then kind of what the benefit is to the Star versus the monetization prospects. But we also haven't lost sight of just innovation and what can we then carve out in order to say, okay, we may not stand to be financially successful playing in this particular space. However, it's really important from the storytelling perspective. It's important for the audience. It's important for our objectives in terms of growing our readership and getting our content out there. So it's a daily balance between kind of those two buckets. And again, we're trying to look to additional product development in order to support that as well.
I think for Canadian television and for producers is just to be pertinent and intelligent, you know? Stop doing what everyone is doing. You know, a format show, you're gonna watch it in the United States, you know? There's no point of, you know, producing and doing always the same thing, and we must arrive with, you know, an alternative and, you know, have like compelling content and good content. And with good content, I'm confident that TV will still be there in 10 years, you know? Maybe we're gonna watch it on a different platform. I don't know what holds the future,
But I think it's also thinking about your content as a flexible piece. Like Jeremy Boxer at Vimeo told me, he's like, don't think of your series as 5 episodes. Think of it as 4 stories, 4 artists times 5. That's 20 mini episodes on Vimeo, subscription based. You know, so you have to start thinking in different models as well. You know, as you're doing your long form or short form, see how they can fit on different venues.
and trust your content. I mean, when we developed the Toronto's program, everyone told us, you know, you're never gonna get a green light, you know? And we got a green light, and when we were like working on the concept, we decided to have 1 Canadian character in each episode, and everyone was telling you, you're never gonna sell this elsewhere. You know, no one is interested in having a Canadian character. And we sold it to the States and to Sweden. I mean, so just trust your content, be pertinent, and you'll be there.
And approach your story with very innovative, you know, view, like how you say, it's like it's 4 artists, it's 5 stories, it's like it's not necessarily those 22 minutes that we've been forced to box in. So, you know, both of those perspectives from platforms and from creators are really pushing innovation. That's how we'll deal with new business models. In the time that we have, I'd like to bring to the floor for questions and open up this conversation. Don't all raise your hands at once. Yes. There's a microphone right there.
Hi. So I work in public relations, and part of our job is to help brands create compelling stories and then talk to media and ideally get those stories shared. So what can we do as PR reps when we email media? Like, I know you're talking about animation and videos, and if we pre-write tweets, like what can we do to make sure when you get these compelling stories, they make they make more sense, or you're more likely to use them?
I would make sure you're doing the research and finding the right, very specific right person to target with that, because we all get inundated with so many releases. I have probably a bad habit from your point of view of finding all the releases that have attachments of like over 5 to 10 megs and just deleting them because it fills up my inbox and I can't send any emails. So I got a release yesterday from this technology firm that put together satellite images of Fort McMurray before and after, right? And that was a very pertinent, targeted press release to a particular group of people within our newsroom that had very, very timely effect, right? And so we looked at that and said, this is actually something really useful at the time of what we're doing. I mean, it's more research, I think, on your part probably to find the particular people, but I think developing those relationships and conversations is probably the best way of going about it.
So knowing the audience that you want to target, I would chime in and say hiring the right storyteller to make sure that the pitch that you're offering is that authentic, genuine story, even if it's brand-supported content. We talk a lot about documentaries that are supported by brands, which is like, ooh, when do those two intersect? But they're starting to quite successfully, and throughout the long form and short form, and it even when the brands are not even mentioned in the story. We see a lot of that work in an entire workshop on it today at the festival, but see more that this space can explore. So, yeah, good question. And there's one right next to you. Oh, right back there. Thank you.
Yes, hi. I'm really inspired by the stories that are coming out of the big press, like the Globe and Mail and CBC, Toronto Star. I live in a smaller community and I'm not seeing that kind of engagement at the local level. Our small papers are just very much sticking to the old-fashioned model. Every now and again they might tweet something out, but there's no community engagement at that level. So what are the solutions for some of the smaller communities to get into this level of engagement that the larger communities are?
That's an interesting question. One, because I think our local communities have really been hit hard by what's been happening throughout the industry. There's probably a map that exists out there at somewhere that shows you kind of where news outlets have disappeared over the period of the last 10 years and kind of what communities are being underserved by that. And we're only now trying to kind of understand the implication of that. So that's one. But two, those that remain, I think it's a knowledge transfer. It's education. It's getting kind of those outlets to get up to speed, I guess you could say, on really how news is evolving and the distribution of news is evolving. And unfortunately, I don't know if there's a real simple solution in the way that I think it has to start from within or it has to be asked for by that particular community surrounding them. I mean, certainly, from the Toronto Star's perspective, we are meant to serve the GTA as a whole and beyond. And I would say even on a day-to-day basis, we struggle with that in the way that we're conscious of the fact that we may not be getting our particular message out to, say, the Bramptons or the Vaughns or over into Pickering, and really kind of not acknowledging and telling their stories as well too. So all this to say, I don't think there's an easy answer. However, if there is some type of incentive or motive by the community in order to ask for more from those outlets, then maybe that would be a beginning point.
Yeah, and I think the journalists at those outlets, by and large, are really keen. So I was at a conference, a training session in Halifax over the weekend with a bunch of Atlantic papers, really small papers, like papers with 2 or 3 journalists at them. And I was struck by the career journalists there, been there 25, 27 years, and they're shooting stuff on their phones. They just need a little bit of extra training on like how to produce a video with their phone, how to shoot a photo, how to do a little bit of audio, and how to tweet. Like they want to learn so badly. There's not a resistance. It's just an overwhelming. What tools do I use and how do I do it? And it's actually like kind of a practical training that's really needed.
Resources and training. And
Yeah.
a great, as you mentioned before, opportunity for partnerships. Seeing where communities could come together and create larger partnerships is another.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing, just like an interesting anecdote, is that some people, so the BBC is coming up for renewal in terms of their license with the community, and there's actually kind of a push among some in the UK that the BBC should be offering some of its technology to local media outlets, because the big problem that the local media outlets also have is they don't have content management systems or publishing systems that allow them to do the type of storytelling that's really great. So in the UK, some people are arguing that if I'm paying X amount of money to the BBC, should that technology that I'm funding, i.e. the CMS that they have, the technology that they're building, also benefit other smaller outlets? Which is kind of an interesting, fascinating argument. Because technology is such a barrier to
Good point.
Great question.
Yeah. We've got a question over here.
Hi, John Gill. I was wondering if you could just step back from the actual story and talk a bit about how the overarching editorial is maintained at your respective companies. So, you made the point about the Star being 100% behind all of its stories. Well, somebody actually selects, I assume, what goes first and what is leading off during the day or during any period of time. As more and more information comes at you, how does that process of filtering and deciding, okay, what's going to be my lead, what's going to be the story that I focus my resources behind, is that changing or is it essentially the same?
Interesting question. I would say that what social media, particularly arguably just the internet, has done for publishers is that it's made us more aware of what the public would like us to cover. So there's less of you know, it's changed our operation in the way that you arguably used to have about 10 people sitting around a table in actual literal closed off walls to the outside world versus now, you know, we're seeing streams of information come into us all day long where we may say that in the morning, this is really what is happening and where we should be placed versus at, you know, 5 o'clock at night. That's completely changed just given kind of what's emerged in our communities and what's, you know, what are emerging stories. What I would say as well is that sorry, I'm blanking on that for 1 second. That there still is the aspect of, at least in particular to the Star, we have a very, very firm mandate, and you know, its foundation is in social justice, and that comes up daily within every, whatever lens we're looking at an editorial file. So there are a number of those factors that come into consideration when we're trying to kind of set that editorial file into place. But I think it's only improved over the last number of years with, you know, first-party data, social media, you know, kind of a better understanding and knowledge of our audience, and also layering that over our firm mandate as to what we stand to serve and bring to this community.
Yeah, it's great. Great response. Yes, question over here.
You folks talked about packaging stories for different pipes, different mediums, and so on. Are you also packaging for different demographics? Like a story, would you have one refinement for an older audience and another refinement for a younger audience?
Interesting. That's just kind of implicit in the platforms, I guess, right?
Yeah, like I would say, so we have 3 distinct products at the Star. We know the average age of the consumers on those products. We also have our target demographic that we would like to achieve for revenue purposes on those products, and also for audience growth and longevity on those products. We keep that information front of mind when we're assessing a story, when we're looking at what's covered, and kind of back to your question. Is it practical for us, or is it even possible for us to kind of rejig a story 3 times? No. So in some cases, you know, a print audience might be underserved by something that we're targeting specifically for, or just naturally falls into play on a mobile first or a social Snapchat type coverage. You know, the goal is balance, but it's very, very difficult to achieve, I would say.
Yeah, like we know how we would have the technology to target by specific demographics if we wanted to. The analytics that we have, you know, like, tell us what what the primary demographic is for a particular platform, and we keep that in mind. But I think it just really comes back to like, what's the best way of telling this story on this platform for people who use that as a tool of consumption, more than anything.
Yeah, an interesting thought. I was chatting with someone about Snapchat, and they're like, if you don't know what it is, you're too old to use it. So I wouldn't.
That's not true. That's not true.
Really? I don't know. But I think it's an interesting point to understand that it's really the pipe that dictates the demographic and not necessarily the story.
Yeah, and even Snapchat, right? Like Snapchat, but like BuzzFeed is doing a lot of really great, you know, original investigative journalism. Snapchat, Wall Street Journal is on Snapchat, but like that is not Snapchat's core demographic or the Wall Street Journal's core demographic, but they both see that overlap, right? And when Snapchat wants their audience to grow and even be older, and the Wall Street Journal wants to reach, you know, younger, business savvy people, and everybody's using Snapchat, right? So that's.
You can follow the Star on Snapchat at Toronto Star News. So we covered the Ghomeshi trial through Snapchat. We have a bunch of different series that we're just kind of, you know, getting our feet wet in. We do kind of a Fast Friday car review every Friday. We have a beauty session every Thursday. Again, that's kind of the stuff that I put in that bucket of like, we're not, you know, there's no revenue opportunity for Canadian publishers currently, that it's really been hived off for US publishers or international publishers at this point. But for us to say, you know, as storytellers, that we don't want to be in a highly visual, fun, you know, interactive platform, I mean, we wouldn't be doing our jobs at that point.
Yeah. but it's a struggle. Sorry, I just keep belaboring the point, but it's a struggle from a staffing point of view.
Yes.
In terms of like, you know, so Wall Street Journal has 5 people who use Snapchat for them, if that's their full-time job, right? Like, we don't have that luxury. So you're pulling from, I'm sure it's the same thing, you're pulling from here, and it's like, oh, can I get a couple hours to do something for Snapchat? You know,
And as a creator, creator, of that content as well, you're even dividing your hats up even more to say, okay, I need my feed for Instagram, my feed for Snapchat, my feed for Facebook and Twitter, and what am I doing with this content to make sure it reaches all these different outlets?
Well, looking at social media consumption pattern, like I have a question for you guys. Like, is that because just recently somebody told me that there's a certain time of day where it's the best time to post on Facebook or on Twitter, or
Yeah.
I mean, you guys obviously look at that in terms of when does the story need to go out
When during
to
the
get the
week.
most.
Yeah, and we have a program that we use in order to schedule that, but it still requires a person sitting there putting into that program as well too.
Yeah, yeah.
So we certainly take advantage of all the data that we have to say we're making the smartest decisions to align with current resources and staffing as well. But that helps, right? It helps in the way that we know that we're being arguably the most effective that we can be, given that we've got that information coming in. So for us in particular, weekends are a huge opportunity on mobile and social, as well as evenings and early mornings, and so making some of that. Again, I think it was the initial question. I don't know if we actually talked about, but how journalism's changed over the last 10 years. That to me is a change and a huge advantage, because previously, in terms of even what stories we wanted to tell and how we wanted to tell them, you weren't flying blind, but you were just making those decisions based off your gut instinct. And I think we will all always go back to our gut. Like, at the end of the day, 100% gut. However, there are all of these other tools and information that we have at our fingertips that help inform a better gut check.
Yeah, that's what our editor chief likes to say, is that we got the gut down, right? Like, we've been doing the gut thing for a long time. It's time to pay attention to the numbers and like figure out what the right balance is between gut and data. And that's what we're trying to figure out.
And that's the notion of, like you're saying, journalism hasn't changed, but the delivery method has. And understanding how to feed it out to those people and to audiences is really what's compelling. And similar with you take to the long form documentary or series documentary work, it's the same space. Do we have another question or two? No? Final thoughts to wrap this up. We've got just another minute or so in this session before lunch. What's your best advice for audiences in this space? In terms of, how they engage with you, how they work with you. You were saying earlier before that it's, audiences don't necessarily dictate what they want, but when you change something, that's when everyone comes in and up for it. Like, wait, I love that, bring it back, I miss it. And as a consumer, what do you want to tell audiences?
Well, maybe just starting off on that point, we are here, like the foundation of what reporters and publishers do is to create dialogue and community. And yes, we might, have an office space over here. However, we are accessible, and I think the onus is on us as well to show how accessible we are and how we would love to continue that dialogue so that we're proactively and collaboratively making decisions with our audience and readerships versus us, as I gave the example before, us taking something away and then having a revolt happen after the fact. I know from on the Toronto Star side, we do surveys, we have advisory panels, we do ask for people to kind of join us in those conversations, and so, passionate and active readers, I hope they would take us up on that call.
I think that one thing is this morning they were talking about keeping that audience at the center of the conversation, and to me it's not just about catering to that elusive millennial audience, it's like making them part of the dialogue. Like for us, we work with seasoned older professionals, we're in our 40s, but we also work with 20-year-olds who are researchers and directors, and so it's that dialogue that you need to bring them into the conversation so that you create something more pertinent at the end of the day. And I think it's about, yes, it's about new approaches, but it's also about experience. We come from a television world, but the television world has been a big school for me, like in terms of how to tell a story in its most impactful way.
What I would like to say to the audience of television is please don't give us on us. Don't give up on us. You know, we're changing, we're going to be there, and I think we're getting better. Yeah.
I agree. They ask for it. The audience asks for curation. They ask for discoverability. They ask to be, directed to, and what it feels like it's really out of this conversation, and such a positive one, is that platforms are understanding better how to connect with them, creators are discovering how to reach them, and curators are understanding that space as well. And so as these different mediums sort of intersect, it's nice that we keep story at its core and work hard to get the delivery out to those audiences. This has been a dynamic conversation. Thank you all so much to Nabil and Frank from CBC's Interrupt This program, and to Matt Freer from the Globe Mail, and Erica from the Toronto Star. Thank you all so much for this.